everyone, welcome to my channel. It's the day 4 of our book reading series, Read with RACHANA, and I am so excited to continue this journey. First of all, thank you so much for showering all the love and support to me. It really means a lot. Thank you so much. And if you like what I do, if you like my contents, please hit the subscribe button. Please share it with your friends and family who are interested in this type of contents, and keep supporting. So yesterday we were in the second part of our Becoming Me, that is the first chapter. So let's get into it. Okay. Decline can be a hard thing to measure, especially when you are in the midst of it. Every September, when Craig and I showed up back at Bryan Moore Elementary, we would find fewer white kids on the playground. Some had transferred to a nearby Catholic school, but many had left the neighborhood altogether. At first, it felt like if just the white families were leaving, but then that changed too. It soon seemed that anyone who had the means to go was now going. Much of the time, the departures went unannounced and unexplained. We would see a for sale sign in front of the Yakar family's house, or a moving van in front of Teddy's, and know what was coming. Perhaps the biggest blow to my mother came when our friend Velma Stewart announced that she and her husband had put a down payment on a house in suburb called Park Forest. The Stewarts had 2 kids and lived down the block of Euclid. Like us, they were apartment dwellers. Mrs. Stewart had a wicked sense of humor and a big infectious laugh, which drew my mother to her. The two of them swapped recipes and kept up with each other, but never fell into the neighborhood's gossip cycle the way other mothers did. Mrs. Stewart's son, Donnie, was Craig's age and just as athletic, giving the two of them an instant bond. Her daughter, Pamela, was a teenager already and not so interested in me, though I found all the teenagers intriguing. I don't remember much about Mr. Stewart, except that he drove a delivery truck for one of the big bakery companies in the city, and that he and his wife and their kids were the lightest skinned black people I had ever met. How they afforded a place in the suburbs, I couldn't guess. Park Forest, it turns out, was one of America's first fully planned communities, not just a housing subdivision, but a full village designed for about 30,000 people, with shopping malls, churches, schools and parks. Founded in 1948, it was in many ways meant to be the paragon of urban life, with mass-produced houses and cookie-cutter yards. There were also quotas for how many black families could live on a given block, though by the time the Stewarts got there, the quotas had apparently been abolished. Not long after they moved, the Stewarts invited us to come visit them on one of my dad's day off. We were excited. For us, it would be a new kind of outing, a chance to glimpse the fabulous suburbs. The 4 of us took the Buick south on the expressway, following the road out of Chicago, exiting about 40 minutes later near a sterile-looking shopping plaza. We were soon winding through a network of quiet streets, following Mrs. Stewart's direction, turning from one nearly identical block to the next. Park Forest was like a miniature city of tract homes, modest ranch-style places with soft grey shingles and a newly planted saplings and bushes out front. Now, why would anyone want to live all the way out here? My father asked, staring over the dashboard. I agreed that it made no sense. As far as I could see, there were no big trees like the giant oak that sat outside my bedroom window at home. Everything in Park Forest was new and wide and uncrowded. There was no corner liquor store with ratty guys hanging out in the front of it. There were no cars honking or sirens. There was no music floating from anybody's kitchen. The windows in the house all looked to be shut. Craig would remember our visit there as heavenly, namely because he played ball all day long in the wide open lots under a blue sky with Donnie Stewart and his new pack of suburban brethren. My parents had a pleasant enough catch-up with Mr. and Mrs. Stewart, and I followed Pamela around, gaping at her hair, her fair skin and teenager jewelry. At some point we all had lunch. It was evening when we finally said goodbye. Leaving the Stewarts, we walked in the docks to the curb where my dad had parked the car. Craig was sweaty, dead on his feet after all the running he had done. I too was fatigued and ready to go home. Something about the place had put me on edge. I wasn't a fan of the suburbs though. I couldn't articulate exactly why. My mother would later make an observation about the Stewarts and their new community, based on the fact that almost all of their neighbors on the street seemed to be white. I wonder, she said, if nobody knew that they are a black family until we came to visit. She thought that maybe we would unwittingly outed them, arriving from the south side with a housewarming gift and our conspicuous dark skin. Even if the Stewarts weren't deliberately trying to hide their race, they probably didn't speak of it one way or another with their new neighbors. Whatever vibe existed on their block, they hadn't overly disrupted it, at least not until we came to visit. Was somebody watching through a window as my father approached our car that night? Was there a shadow behind some curtain, waiting to see how things would go? I'll never know. I just remember the way my dad's body stiffened slightly when he reached the driver's side door and saw what was there. Someone had scratched a line across the side of his beloved Buick, a thin, ugly gulch that ran across the door and towards the tail of the car. It had been done with a key or a rock and was in no way accidental. I have said before that my father was a withstander, a man who never complained about small things or big, who cheerily ate liver when it was served to him, who had a doctor give him what amounted to a death sentence and that just carried on. This thing with the car was no different. If there was some way to fight it, if there was some door to pound in response, my dad wouldn't have done it anyway. Well, I'll be damned, he said before unlocking the car. We rode back to the city that night without much discussion about what had happened. It was too exhausting, maybe too sparse. In any event, we were done with the suburbs. My father must have had to drive the car to work the next day looking the way it did, and I'm sure that didn't sit well with him. But the gas in his chromosome didn't stay for long. As soon as there was time, he took the car over to the body shop at Shears and had it erased. We completed the part 2 of the first chapter and we will be heading to part 3. Somewhere along the way, my normally laid back brother started to sprout worries. I can't say exactly when or why this began, but Craig, the boy who could high-five and what up his way around the neighborhood, who blatantly cat-napped any time he had 10 minutes free, regardless of his surroundings, grew more faithful and vigilant at home, convinced that catastrophe was creeping our way. In the evenings at our apartment, he rehearsed every outcome, immersing himself in hypotheticals as the rest of us found bizarre. Worried he had lose his sight, he took to wearing a blindfold around the house, learning to navigate our living room and kitchen by feel. Worried he might go deaf, he began teaching himself sign language. There was also apparently the threat of amputation, prompting Craig to fumble his way through various meals and homework sessions with his right arm tied behind his back, because you never did know. Craig's biggest fear, however, was probably the most realistic, and that was fire. House fires were a regular occurrence in Chicago, in part due to slumlords who let their buildings slide into disrepair and were all too happy to reap the insurance benefits when a fire tore through, and in part because home smoke detectors were a relatively new development and still expensive for working class people to afford. Either way, inside our tight city grid, fire was almost a fact of life, a random but persistent snatcher of homes and hearts. My grandfather's Southside had moved to our neighborhood after a fire destroyed his old house on the west side, though luckily nobody had been hurt. According to my mother, Southside stood on the curb outside the burning house, shouting for the firelighters to direct their horses away from his precious jazz albums. More recently, in a tragedy almost too giant for my young mind to take in, one of my 5th grade classmates, a boy with sweet face and a tall Alfred named Lester Emculum, who lived around the corner from us in a townhouse, and sister, the 3 of us trapped by flames in bedroom upstairs. Theirs was the first wake I ever attended. Every kid in the neighborhood sobbing in the funeral parlor as his Action 5 album played softly in the background. The adults stoned in silence, no prayer or platitude capable of filling the void. There were 3 closed caskets at the front of the room, each one with a framed photograph of a smiling child on its lid. Mrs. McCullum, who was with her husband, had managed to survive the fire by jumping out of a window, sat before them so slumped and broken that it hurt to look into her direction. For days afterward, the skeleton of the MC Cullums burned out town house continued to hiss and cave in on itself, dying far more slowly than its young occupants had. The smell of the smoke lingered heavily in the neighborhood. As time passed, Craig's anxieties only grew. At school, he had been put through the paces of a teacher-led evacuation drills, dutifully enduring lectures on how to stop, drop and roll, and as a result Craig decided that we needed to step it up on safety at home, electing himself the family fire marshal with me as its lieutenant, ready to clear exit pathways during drills or boss around our parents as needed. We weren't so much convinced that we would have a fire as we were fixated on being ready for one. Preparation mattered. Our family was not punctual. We arrived early to everything, knowing that it made my dad less vulnerable, sparing him from having to worry about finding a parking spot that didn't require him to walk a long way or an accessible seat in the bleacher at one of the Craig's basketball games. The lesson being that in life you can control what you can. To this end, as kids, we ran through our escape route possibilities, trying to guess whether we could jump from a window to the oak tree in front of the house or to a neighbor's rooftop in the event of a fire. We imagined what would happen if a grease fire broke out in the kitchen, or if an electrical fire started in the basement, or if lightning struck from above. Craig and I had little concern about our mom in an emergency. She was small and agile, and one of those people who, if her adrenaline got going, could probably bench press a car off a baby. What was harder to talk about was Dad's disability, the obvious but unstated truth that he couldn't readily leap from a window like the rest of us, and it had been years since we had seen him run. So things get crazy. We realize our rescue wouldn't unfold the way rescues did in the tidy after school movies we watched on TV. It wouldn't be our dads who would throw us over his soldiers with Herculean grace and carry us to safety. If anyone, it would have to be Craig, who will eventually tower over my father but was then still a narrow-shouldered, spindle-legged boy who seemed to understand that any heroics on his part would require practice, which is why during our family fire drills started conjuring the worst-case scenarios, ordering my dad to the floor, instructing him to lie there limp and as heavy as a sack, as if he would pass out from the smoke inhalation. "Oh, good Lord," Dad would say, shaking his hand. "You are really going to do this?" My father was not accustomed to being helpless. He lived his life in defiance of that very prospect, assiduously looking after our car, paying the bill on time, never discussing his advancing multiple sclerosis, nor missing a day of work. To the contrary, my father loved to be the rock for others. What he couldn't do physically, he substituted with emotional and intellectual guidance and support, which is why he enjoyed his work as a pre-necked captain for the city's Democratic Party. He would hail the post for years, in part because loyal service to the party machine was more or less expected of city employees. Even if he had been half forced into it, though my dad loved the job, which baffled my mother given the amount of time it demanded. He paid weekend visits to a nearby neighborhood to check on his constituents, often with reluctantly in tow. We would park the car and walk along the streets of modest bungalows, landing on a doorstep to find a hunched-over widow or a big-bellied factory worker with a can of Mitchelle peering through the screen door. Often these people were delighted by the sight of my father smiling broadly on their porch, propped up by his cane. "Well, fresh air," they would say. "What a surprise. Get on in here." For me, this was never good news. It meant we were going inside. It meant that my whole Saturday afternoon would now get chalked up as I got parked on a musty sofa or with a 7-Up at a kitchen table while my dad fielded feedback complaints really that he would pass on to the elected alderman who controlled the ward. When somebody had problems with garbage pickup or snow plowing or was irritated by a pothole, my dad was there to listen. His purpose was to help people feel cared for by the Democrats and to vote accordingly when elections roll around. To my dismay, he never rushed anyone along. Time, as far as my father was concerned, was a gift he gave to other people. He clocked approvingly at pictures of cute grandkids, patiently endured gossip and long litanies of health woes and nodded knowingly at stories about how money was tight. He hugged the old ladies as he finally left their houses, assuring them that he would do his best to be useful, to get the fixable issues fixed. My dad had faith in his own utility. It was a point of pride, which is why at home during our fire drills, he had little interest in being a passive prop, even in a pretend crisis. He had no intention under any circumstance of being a liability, of winding up the unconscious guy on the floor, but still some part of him seemed to understand that this mattered to us, to Craig in particular. When we asked him to lie down, he would humor us, dropping first to his knees, then to his butt, then spreading himself out obligingly, face up to the living room carpet. He would exchange glances with my mother, who found it all a little funny, as if to say, "These damn kids." With a sigh, he would close his eyes, waiting to feel Craig's hands hook themselves solidly beneath his shoulders to start the rescue operation. My mother and I would then watch, as with no small amount of effort and a good deal of awkwardness, my brother managed to drag 170 or so pounds of paternal dead weight backwards through the imaginary inferno that raised in his pre-adolescent mind, hauling my father across the floor, rounding the couch, and finally making it to the stairwell. From here, Craig figured he could probably slide my dad's body down the stairs and out the side door to safety. My father always refused to let him practice this part, saying gently, "That's enough now," and insisting on getting back to his feet before Craig could try to lug him down the stairs. But between the small man and the grown man, the point had been made. None of this would be easy or comfortable if it came to it, and there were of course no guarantees that any of us would survive. But if the very worst happened, we at least had a plan. Slowly, I was becoming more outward and social, more willing to open up myself to the messes of the wider world. My natural resistance to chaos and spontaneity had been worn down somewhat through all the hours I had spent trailing my father through his precinct visits, plus all the other weekend outings we made, dropping in on our dozen of uncles, aunts and cousins, sitting in thick clouds of barbecue smoke in someone's backyard, or running around with the neighborhood kids in a neighborhood that wasn't ours. My mother was one of 7 children in her family. My father was the oldest of 5. My mother's relative tended to gather at Southside House around the corner, drawn by my grandfather's cooking, the ongoing game of bead whist, and the exuberant blasting of jazz. Southside acted as a magnet for all of us. He was forever mistrustful of the world beyond his own yard, worried primarily about everyone's safety and well-being, and as a result poured his energy into creating an environment where we were always well fed and entertained, likely with the hope we would never want to move away from it. He even got me a dog, an affable cinnamon collar shepherd mutt we called Rex. Per my mother's order, Rex wasn't allowed to live at our house, but I would visit him all the time at Southside, lying on the floor with my face buried in his soft fur, listening to his tail thwop appreciatively anytime Southside walked past. Southside spoiled the dog the same way he spoiled me, with food and love and tolerance, all of it a silent, earnest plea our neighbor to leave him. My father's family, meanwhile, spread across Chicago's broader Southside and included an array of great aunts and third cousins, plus a few stray outliers whose blood connection remained cloudily. We orbited between all of them. I quietly assessed where we were going by the number of trees I would see on the street outside. The poorer neighborhoods often had no trees at all, but to my dad, everyone was keen. He lighted up when he saw his uncle Caligo, a skinny, wavy-haired little man who looked like Sammy Davis Jr. and was almost always drunk. He adored his Aunt Vedral, who lived with her 8 children in a neglected apartment building next to the Dan Ryan Expressway, in a neighborhood where Craig and I understood that the rules of survival were very different. On Sunday afternoons, all 4 of us normally took the 10 minutes drive north to the Parkway Gardens to eat dinner with my dad's parents, whom we called Dandy and Grandma, and his 3 youngest siblings, Andrew, Carleton and Francesca, who had been born more than a decade after my father and thus seemed more like sister and brother to us than aunt and uncles. My father, I thought, seemed more like a father and less like a brother with the 3 of them, offering them advice and slipping them cash when they needed it. Francisca was smart and beautiful and sometimes let me brush her long hair. Andrew and Carleton were in their early 20s and dazzlingly hip. They wore bell bottoms and turtlenecks. They owned leather jackets, had girlfriends, and talked about things like Malcolm X and Saul Power. Craig and I passed hours in their bedroom at the back of the apartment just trying to sponge off their cool. My grandfather, also named Fisher Robinson, was decidedly less fun to be around. A cigar-puffing patriarch who would sit in his recycler with a newspaper open on his lap and the evening news blaring on his television nearby. His demeanor was nothing like my father's. For Dandy, everything was an irritant. He was guilt by the day's headlines, by the state of the world as shown on TV, by the young black men, boo-boos he called them, when he perceived to be hanging uselessly around the neighborhood, giving black people everywhere a bad name. He shouted at the television. He shouted at my grandmother, a sweet, soft-spoken woman and devout Christian named Lavang. My parents had named me Mitchelle Lavang Robinson in honor of her. Oh, okay. By day, my grandmother expertly managed a thriving Bible bookstore on the far south side. But in her off hours with Dandy, she was reduced to a meekness I found perplexing even as a young girl. She cooked his meals and absorbed his barrage of complaints and said nothing in her own defense. Even at a young age, there was something about my grandmother's silence and passivity in her relationship with Dandy that got under my skin. According to my mother, I was the only person in the family to talk back to Daddy when he yelled. I did it regularly from the time I was very young and over many years, in part because it drove me crazy that my grandmother wouldn't speak up for herself, in part because everyone else fell silent around him, and lastly because I loved Dandy as much as he confounded me. His stubbornness was something I recognized, something I would inherit myself, though I hoped in a less abrasive form. There was also a softness in Dandy which I caught only in glimmers. He tenderly rubbed my neck sometimes when I sat at the foot of his reclining chair. He smiled when my dad said something funny or one of us kids managed to slip a sophisticated word into a conversation. But then something would set him off and he would start smiling again. Quite shouting at everyone, Dandy, I would say, or don't be mean to grandma, often I would add. What's got you so mad anyway? The answer to that question was both complicated and simple. Dandy himself would leave it unanswered, shrugging crankily in response to my interference and returning to his newspaper. Back at home, though, my parents would try to explain. Dandy was from the South Carolina low country, having grown up in the humid seaport of Georgetown, where thousands of slaves once labored on vast plantations, harvesting crop of rice and indigo, making their owners rich. My grandfather, born in 1912, was the grandson of slaves, the son of milk worker, and oldest of what would be 10 children in his family. A quick-witted and intelligent kid, he had been nicknamed the professor and set his sights early on the idea of someday going to college. But now, not only was he black and from a poor family, he also come of age during the Great Depression. After finishing high school, Dandy went to work with a lumber mill, knowing that if he stayed in Georgetown, his option would never widen. When the mill eventually closed, like many African Americans of his generation, he took a chance and moved north to Chicago, joining what became known as the Great Migration, in which 6 million Southern blacks relocated to big northern cities over the course of 5 decades, fleeing racial oppression and chasing industrial jobs. If this was an American dream story, Dandy, who arrived in Chicago in the early 1930s, would have found a good job and a pathway to college. But the reality was far different. Jobs were hard to come by, limited at least somewhat by the fact that managers at some of the big factories in Chicago regularly hired European immigrants over African American workers. Dandy took what work he could find, setting pins in a bowling alley and freelancing as a handyman. Gradually, he downgraded his hopes, letting go of the idea of college, thinking he would train to become an electrician instead. But this too was quickly thwarted. If he wanted to work as an electrician, or a steel worker, carpenter, or a plumber for that matter, any of the big job sites in Chicago, you needed a union card, and if you were black, the overwhelming odds were that you weren't going to get one. This particular form of discrimination altered the destinies of generations of African Americans, including many of the men in my family, limiting their income, their opportunity, and eventually their aspirations. As a carpenter, Southside wasn't allowed to work for the larger construction firm that offered steady pay on long-term projects, given that he couldn't join a labor union. My great uncle Terry, Robbie's husband, had abandoned a career as a plumber for the same reason, instead becoming a Pullman porter. There was also Uncle Pete on my mother's side, who had been unable to join the taxi drivers union and instead turned to driving an unlicensed jeepney, picking up customers who lived in less safe parts of the west side, where normal cabs didn't like to go. These were highly intelligent, able-bodied men who were denied access to stable, high-paying jobs, which in turn kept them from being able to buy homes, send their kids to college, or save for retirement. It pained them, I know, to be cast aside, to be stuck in jobs that they were overqualified for, to watch white people leapfrog past them at work, sometimes training new employees they knew might one day become their bosses, and it bred within each of them at least a basic level of resentment and mistrust. You never quite know what other folks saw you to be. As for Dandy, life wasn't all bad. He met my grandmother while attending church on the south side and ultimately found work through the federal government's Work Progress Administration, the relief program that hired unskilled laborers for public construction projects during the Depression. He then went on to work 30 years as a postal worker before retiring with a pension that helped allow him all the time to yell at the boo-boos on TV from the comfort of his recliner. In the end, he had 5 kids who were as smart and disciplined as he was, nominating his second child, who ended up with a degree from Harvard Business School. Wow. Andrew and Caleton would go on to become a train conductor and an engineer respectively. Francisca worked as a creative director in advertising for a time and eventually became a grade school teacher. But still, Dante would remain unable to see his children's accomplishments as any sort of extension of his. As we saw, every Sunday arriving at Parkway Gardens for dinner, my grandfather lived with the bitter residue of his own dashed dreams. So it's the end of today's book series. म भोलि ठ्याक्कै अर्को प्याराग्राफबाट कन्टिन्यू गर्छु. अनि just one thing that I want to mention, if you have any feedback for me, if my voice is too loud or too small for you, or if the tone is not proper, please let me know in the comment section so that I can try to make things easy for you. And यो बुक अहिलेसम्म पढ्दाखेरि चाहिँ मलाई एकदमै राम्रो लागिरहेको छ. अहिलेसम्म चाहिँ मिशेलको प्यारेन्ट्सहरूको ब्याकग्राउन्डदेखि लिएर वाट टाइप अफ कल्चर एन्ड वाट टाइप अफ भ्याल्युज दे क्यारी, अनि मिशेल चाहिँ अहिले लाइक कसरी चाहिँ यो स्टेजमा पुग्यो, हर ग्रोथ कसरी इभोल्युसनरी अथवा रिभोल्युसनरी हुन पुग्यो भन्ने कुराहरू पनि बिस्तारै बिस्तारै बिल्डअप भइरहेको छ. अनि मलाई राम्रो लागिरहेको छ. जस्ट वान मोर थिङ, sometimes I am mispronouncing the word, which I should not be doing it, but I am trying my best, and I really like the fact that this book has lot of amazing vocabs. मैले कति धेरै vocabsहरू पनि सिकिरहेको छु. So thanks to the editor, the writer and everyone. तर कहिलेकाहीँ चाहिँ मिसप्रोनाउन्स गर्दाखेरि चाहिँ यसको मिनिङ डिफ्रेन्ट हुन सक्छ. प्लिज डेफिनेटली इम्प्रुभ अन दिस पार्ट. And thank you so much for watching till the end. Thank you for all the love and support. Keep showing your support and love, and if you like the video, please share it with your friends and family. Thank you so much for staying till the end. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye bye. Take care. Stay safe. Good night.